What up, y'all? I am your host, Vegas, and this is Hip Hop Now podcast bonus episode brought to you by the producers of this podcast over at patreon.com/hiphopnow. Yo, you were saying that too fast. Can you slow down? No, I cannot. But you should know that the link that I just read to you is in the description of this episode. Click on it, visit, read, check it out. And if you like what you've heard from this podcast, you feel like you want to support, see this podcast grow beyond its current status, show some love, show your support. Every dime, every penny, every dollar you put into the production of this podcast actually goes into the production of this podcast. It's documented. Now, this episode is called The Tragedy of Beanie Sigel. Now, a quick history lesson. For those who don't know, there's always somebody new to hip hop, whether they be young, whether they never really like it or understood it, and they're trying to figure that out right now. Beanie Sigel, out of Philly, mostly known as one of the rappers on Jay-Z's Rockefeller Records back in the late 90s. Notorious battle with Jadakiss, Broad Street Bully. You know what I'm saying? Classic verses on other people's albums. Big time, like The Roots, All Things Fall Apart. Man, his verse on there had me going crazy. Paired up with Bleak on a couple of classics. Got some stupid, ridiculous classics with Freeway, known to be with state property and all of that good stuff. Easily can say a Philly hip-hop legend in the short period of time that he reigned. And that's where the tragedy comes into play. Trust me, I didn't mean to do the bars there, but I did. Now, if you're from the future, you know what to do. Get your ass out of here. But if you are not, Beanie Sigel at some point later on in his career, when things weren't going great, the stardom was starting to die down, was shot in the stomach, I believe, and was really kind of fighting for his life as a result. And as a result of the damage that the bullet did, a couple of things had to be removed. But he was alive. And I think a lot of people were relieved because Beanie Sigel, in a lot of ways, according to accounts from Jay-Z, and just Beanie Sigel himself, was somewhat getting in his own way, right? He was highly successful as a hip-hop artist. I named all the accolades. I didn't even get into the fact that he got a couple of dope albums. One in particular that I feel comfortable calling a classic. That's the Becoming. Hands down his best album. Maybe I call it a classic because it's a personal favorite. But I feel comfortable saying it. I mean, I think maybe it's not a universally accepted classic. So maybe it's a classic to me. But nevertheless, I feel it's his best work. And trust me, to say that's his best work when he put in a lot of dope work, that's saying a lot. But at this point in time in his career, you know, the Rockefeller breakup occurred. You know, things were happening all at the same time, and it wasn't the run that Rockefeller was on. It was dying out, right? You had a movie, state property movie. You had state property. Like, there was just so much that was great about what Rockefeller was doing, in particular with Beanie Sigel and his artists, and it all came to an end. But when Beanie Sigel was shot, and they had to save his life, and they had to operate on him, there's one thing that happened to him that's happened to a couple of artists, namely the DOC, namely 50 Cent, namely Conway the Machine. Now, all of those rappers, including Beanie Sigel, have one thing in common. Some form of tragedy, life-threatening tragedy, accident or whatever it may be, happened to them and it altered their voice. In the case of DOC, well, he was never the same again. He sounds nothing like he used to. Nothing at all. There was a point where he barely even had a voice. It was really like raspy, really raspy. And then there was a point recently where it would go in and out, and you could hear it. You could hear his old voice creaking out in an interview. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. It's like his old voice is trying to come back, but it's too damaged. Car accident. 50 Cent. We all know. Shot several times. But in the cheek. To the point where he sort of speaks sort of with his teeth clenched. Sort of how he talks. Right? But for him, it worked out more favorably. Because it worked. It almost sounded like he was rapping like that on purpose. And it didn't sound off. Now, the example you get from those, just naming those two artists, is if you listen to the DOC's debut album, that's how he used to sound. If you listen to 50 Cent's Power of the Dollar, that's how 50 Cent used to sound. You can hear the difference. 50 Cent, obviously, it's subtle, but it's there. DOC is dramatic to the point where it completely ended his solo rap career. Conway the Machine, also shot in the neck. Paralyzed, half his body, I believe, at one point. And then really just paralyzed the side of his face. He thought it was over. He was out. For those Griselda, cats, were you listening to Conway the Machine before he got shot? Because he was already dope and he was already on his way. And then he got shot. And not only does it alter your face to where people look at you and may feel some kind of way, but even with him, now he's also sort of talking out the side of his mouth in a different way, 50 Cent. But guess what? It worked. The imagery, his brother sort of doing the same thing with his face when they would take photos. Made it look like it was on purpose. Now, we know it wasn't on purpose, but nevertheless, it worked. But then we get to Beanie Sigel. Now, we already said what happened to him. We don't need to repeat that. But Beanie Sigel's voice is gone. And not in the same way as DOC, but very close. His voice lacks bass. Not that he had the most bass-driven vocals, but there's no bass, and there's sort of like a struggle. Even if he's not struggling, it's the way it sounds. It's sort of like a struggle to the way he sounds now. Like it's a lot to get the words out, like he's whispering. You can hear old Beanie Sigel in there, but it's so subdued compared to the confidence behind his vocals that you would hear previously. Now, in a lot of ways, right, it doesn't mean that the DOC's pen game was whack just because he couldn't really talk. 50 Cent didn't become whack because he didn't sound the same. Conway the Machine definitely didn't become whack because he didn't sound the same. But with Beanie Sigel, he lost more than his voice. And the reason why I did this podcast episode was because Beanie Sigel appears on Conway's new album, God Don't Make Mistakes. The song is dope. But when Beanie Sigel starts rhyming, I got sad. Because when I heard this song and I heard the way Conway was spitting on there, I was like, man, this is the perfect song to have the Broad Street Bully featured on. And he may still be that in spirit, but he doesn't sound like him. And there's something missing from his bars, or the impact of his bars, that has a lot to do, unfortunately, with his voice. And it shouldn't. But I found myself trying to look past it, especially for a song on an album that feels like poetic justice. Here's two men who got shot, who had their trajectory altered. And in the case of Conway, he kind of rose from the ashes. In the case of Beanie Sigel, it put the finishing touches on his career. It just did. To the point where no one's begging for a Beanie Sigel album. They probably would, but no one wants to say it because it's sad. He can't help what his voice is like now. And I commend him for even trying to do it and not giving up. And maybe there's a different approach for Beanie with his voice being that way. Maybe there's something on the production side they could do to further, enhance his voice. Not change it, but to embrace the way his voice sounds now and to do something with that. I think if he was able to have a verse or a song where people really dug it and felt like Beans is back, he sound different, but he back, I think that would make for better bars, because that would honestly build his confidence, because the man can't be but so confident when he knows what was. And maybe it's just me, right? Maybe I'm putting my feelings on him, and maybe he's fine. But it's still a tragedy for someone who is so dope, who has so much momentum, who could have had so much potential to have it happen this way. Now, don't get me wrong. It's not like he put out a extremely dope album and then this happened. I remember the last album he had was not good before he got shot. It was not good. I forget what it was called. Because, he had The Truth, the Reason, The Becoming. It was something, the After Party. I don't know what it was. It was the something. But it was not good. And I just remember thinking, oh, well, he lived, he's going to be good. And when the first time I heard him rhyme, I was like, oh, man. It's not like it's raspy and you could just make it cool. It's so scratchy and so hoarse sounding. And it sounds so much like he's struggling to get the words out. Even if he isn't, it's a distraction from what he has to say. So I would just say this. Celebrate Beanie Sigel. He's still here. If the man put out a mixtape, go check it out. Give him some downloads. Go buy it. Go buy his old material. Something. I'm not saying he needs it. I don't know. But what I am saying is, it's something that's happened to a number of people in hip-hop, and I just felt the need to reflect on it. That's going to do it for me. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok at Vegas World INC and Clubhouse. Also know that this podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. All you got to do is type in the search bar, Hip Hop Now Podcast, hit subscribe, and stay locked in to weekly hip hop content. If you would like to support this podcast, visit patreon.com/hiphopnow. The link is in the description of this episode. Scroll down and click it. And until next time, y'all, I am not a critic. I'm a fan. Peace.